All right. Welcome everyone who's with us this morning. We will be discussing flow diagrams and the why and how with our instructor, Joanne Giese-Kent. She is a business analyst instructor here at Moraine Park. She loves to teach others about business, and as a business analyst instructor here, she facilitates learning in the online Business Analyst Associate Degree program, along with other business courses. The Moraine Park BA program courses are endorsed by the International Institute of Business Analysis, asserting that these courses meet industry and internationally recognized standards and best practices in business analysis. Joanne has over 25 years experience in marketing, research, and analysis in a variety of industries, including higher ed, economic and entrepreneurial development, baking, and direct marketing. She earned a Bachelor of Business Administration and MBA from UW-Oshkosh. In her spare time, she enjoys hiking and landscaping with native wildflowers and prairie plants. Thank you for joining us today, Joanne. And I am Mindy Boynton. I am a business development manager here in the Economic and Workforce Development Division of the college. We work with business and industry to identify partnerships opportunity, primarily in corporate and customized training. And today we will be holding this discussion to introduce everyone to the swim lane mapping, and we'll have some engagement throughout. And again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring throughout and letting Joanne know as questions come about. With that, we'll go ahead, and Joanne, if you want to kick off the presentation, that would be great.
Sounds great. Thank you, Mindy. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. All right, well, as we are doing this presentation today on June 15th, we have a very, very hot day. So talking about pools and swim lanes might sound really refreshing, right? But today we're not talking about those type of pools. We are talking about process mapping tools, and specifically the swim lane process flow diagrams. So I'm gonna have a couple icebreaker questions to kind of get you warmed up and thinking about swim lanes and process mapping, and just to get me a little background about what you know. We'll talk about the purpose and advantages of using this technique, the different elements or key symbols. We'll go through the how-to steps, including I'll show you an HR example. We won't have time to go through it specifically, but I'll give you some high-level notes about that example. And then finally, I'll talk about the different software that you may use to create those swim lane diagrams. So my first question to you that you can put in the chat, and Mindy's going to have to help monitor that for me. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to see it, but what I want to find out from you is what level of experience do you have with swim lane process flow diagrams? Sometimes they're called cross-functional diagrams or flow charts. So just so that we're all on the same page, the picture on the right shows you an example of a very simple swim lane diagram. So you've got the flow, you know, the start and the finish. You have all the tasks in between, but what's different than a regular traditional flow chart is that you have different roles or people that show who is doing what. So in the chat, could you tell me, A, you've seen these type of things before in maybe your company or another company, but you haven't created one before. B, you've created swim lane diagrams in the past, so maybe at the end you can share some tips or tricks. Or C, I've never heard of them before, and that's why I'm here.
All right, so if you could enter A, B, or C into the chat, that would be great. And it looks like we have a C, an A, C, C.
Okay, all right. So we have an A who's seen them, but really no one's ever created them. So I'll try to give you some helpful tips on how to do them, what software you can use, and we won't have time to actually go through and actually have you create one. Maybe that might be a workshop type of thing in the future, but So today is kind of just a broad overview of what this technique is. So thank you for sharing. So my next question is more of a warm-up question to start having you think about process flow, get you in the mindset of it. You know, what are the steps involved? So we're going to start off with a simple process. So hopefully it's simple. Making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for lunch. Now I want you to pretend that it's not just you making the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Maybe you have some helpers. Who might be those helpers? And it's not just you who's going to eat the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Okay, so that's kind of the scenario. So in the chat field, if you can like just put it in one chat response, like what your answer is for 1, 2, 3, and 4. So think about this. Number 1, who is involved in making and finally eating those peanut butter and jelly sandwiches? Who are the roles, the actors or the participants? Now, again, I'm telling you, pretend it's not just you who's doing it. Who else might be helping you, or who might else be eating the sandwiches? Number 2, identify a starting point for making those peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. So what's the event that prompts you to make those sandwiches? Number 3, identify an ending point to the process. When is the process done? And number 4, this is a wild guess, but maybe kind of think through it a little bit. How many steps do you think it takes to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? That's from the starting point to the ending point and all the steps in between. So I'll give you a minute or two to think about that. So in the chat, if you can answer in just one chat response, what's your answer for 1, 2, 3, and 4? So I kind of have that example on the bottom there.
We'll give everyone a minute or two here to answer that question. And if you aren't sure on any of them, if you want to just answer maybe 2 or 3, would that be all right, Joanne?
That is fine. There's no right or wrong answer. I'm just trying to get you into the mindset and warm you up into thinking about process and steps and who's all could be involved, because that's how you got to get started with swim lane process mapping.
All right, we have Celeste who's saying 1, my family and I, 2, lunch, 3, when sandwiches are consumed, and 4, 5 steps.
5 steps, okay.
Thank you, Celeste, for starting to get into the mindset here. We have Sue who says 1, family, 2, buying the ingredients, 3, eating the sandwich, and 4, 6 steps. And then Jamie, number 1, host and participants. 2, someone is or will be hungry. When the mess is cleaned up. And we've analyzed the process. And 4, 8 steps.
8 steps, okay.
So I think we have just about everyone has
Everybody? Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you for participating and kind of starting to think about that. And this is a relatively easy process. At the end, I'm going to share a video that you might want to check out. It's a really fun video. It's a father who has his kids. He doesn't have them flow it out, but he has them write out the steps of how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And then he follows their steps to the exact T and realizes, oh, what's missing? So, and that's kind of what we're talking about here for process flow is those are some of those advantages to figure out, you know, maybe you're missing some steps that are really important if somebody's trying to follow the process. So thank you for participating and thinking about that. So what really is a swim lane process flow diagram or map that you might want to call it? You might also see it named cross-functional diagram or flow chart. Sometimes they might even call it after the authors of the book Improving Processes that was created in 1990, Rumner and Brockie diagrams. So essentially what these swim lane diagrams or maps are Again, they're very similar to a traditional flow chart that you probably have seen or done yourself, where you have a starting point and a finishing point and all the steps in between. But what this differs is that it adds more clarity and accountability because you're adding who does what. And those who does what, they're actually put in lanes, and that's why it's called a swim lane. And I'll get into a little bit more of the definitions in a few moments. But you're adding lanes to this big swimming pool of the process, so it designates who is doing what and then what those interconnections are between those different roles. So a role could be a department, it could be an employee group, it could be just a simple employee role within, because they all have interconnections. There's not just one group that's probably doing the process. So, and these lanes can either be displayed horizontally or vertically. So the one that I just showed you previously when I asked you the question, what's your experience? That was a vertical column swim lane, where I'm going to be doing an example in a horizontal. And you'll understand that concept in a little bit. But the key thing here is that it shows interconnections and handoffs between those lanes. In a few moments, I'll kind of explain the difference in I'll show you what I started off with to what we created in terms of the swim lane. So swim lanes are also a very key component in business process model and notation, or BPMN. I can't say that really fast. You might see this terminology, especially when you open up the different software like a Visio to create one of these swim lane diagrams. You don't have to get, I'm not going to get into the weeds here explaining it. I do explain this a lot more, and I have my students do a little bit more on the business process model and notation because they're going to be business analysts, or maybe they're in that role already. But essentially what it is, it's using the swim lane diagrams, but to the next level of detail. So it gets really into detailed sequence of tasks. It has different symbols and stuff like that. But I just wanted to make you aware that you might see that terminology or that acronym and be like, what is that? It's just a higher level or next level of detail that you may or may not need to worry about. So on the left, this is the flow chart that I started off with. What I did is I worked with the talent acquisition manager in our HR department to figure out a process to map out for today. And the flow chart that you see there is the current flow chart of the hiring process. I know it's really small, but it's a traditional flow chart that gives all the different steps. You can see all the steps in activities, and there is a decision in a couple places where you see the diamond. But when I was looking at it, I'm like, well, who is doing what each one of those steps? I've been through the process before as a hiring manager, as well as an applicant and candidate. So I'm familiar with the process, but I don't know exactly who is doing all what steps. And that's what a swim lane diagram can help with. So I'm taking that simple diagram or flow chart and making it into a more robust diagram that really understands who's doing what. So what I found out is that these four people on the right-hand side, or four groups or roles, are involved. It's the hiring manager, the talent acquisition, and HR. I kind of put them into one row by themselves, the interview team, and then the applicant or candidate. So I took that simple flow chart and made a horizontal swim lane. Now you might look at this and like, oh gosh, that looks really complicated. But once you follow the flow and the arrows, it makes it really clear to know who is responsible for what and what those handoffs are and those interconnections. So the main advantages or benefits of swim lane diagrams compared to like a regular flow chart is that both give a visual representation of a process from the start to the finish. But what a swim lane does, it really highlights who is doing what. You know, the right hand understands what the left hand is doing. So it shows that clarity and accountability. It helps with clear communication, consistency, but also I want you to think about it's more system thinking. Even though when you think we're talking about swim lanes, and if you're thinking like an Olympic swimming pool and all the lanes that the swimmers are in, they have to stay in their lane. Well, if you're thinking about a swim lane diagram for a process, yes, we have people that stay in their lane and are accountable for those activities and that flow, but systems thinking is now you know how your role and what your tasks affect the other lanes. And that's one of the clear, important advantages of this process or this technique is. But once you map out maybe a current process, you can figure out maybe there's a lot of wasted steps, non-value-added tasks, maybe there's some bottlenecks, maybe there's some duplicate steps, or why is this happening? Maybe you're missing some steps as well. And maybe this is time that you have to reevaluate and do a process improvement. So when you're mapping it out and understanding who's doing what and that whole system thinking, maybe that can help you increase your productivity. And maybe eventually, maybe that process becomes like a competitive advantage. And this swim lane diagram really is a business analysis tool that business analysts use all the time, but anyone can use it. It's very versatile. It can be applied to any department, any industry, anyone can use it. And it doesn't take too much time to really grasp it in like one of the software programs and to do it yourself. So what are the key symbols? What do I need to learn and understand? So the first one is the pool, not the swimming pool that we would like to jump in today because it's so hot, but it's the pool. It represents the process and all the major participants or actors that are involved. The lanes within that pool represent the task and the flow for that role or that participant or that actor that is doing those tasks. Circle signifies the start and the end of the event within the process. If you get into the business process model and notation, which is that higher level mapping, they have different type of circles that mean different things, the same way with the rectangles and stuff like that. I'm not going to get into that, but you might see that when you open up the software and see some of those extra symbols. But like, I'm trying to remember on the peanut butter and jelly sandwich examples, people are hungry and that's how it starts the process, or you're buying the ingredients and that's how it starts the process. And the end of the process is when you actually enjoy and eat the sandwiches. The rectangle represents the task or the activity. And again, it can be a squared or hard edge rectangle, or it can be a rounded rectangle. You'll see different types of symbols once you get into a software. And again, it depends on if you're using standard swim lane, flowchart symbols, or the BPMN. The diamond is the gateway. It represents the decision-making activities, the conditions, whether it's a yes or no, and you flow this way or you flow that way, or whatever the decisions are. And I'll show you a couple of those diamond or gateways in the process I mapped out. And obviously the arrow represents the flow of the process. Sometimes you might have a dashed arrow, which might be a message or more information sent than necessarily an actual step. So what are the how-tos? So obviously the first thing is, what process are you going to map and to what level of detail do you need it? So you talk to your SMEs or your subject matter experts, who are involved in the process. Find out, who does what and what level of detail do you need it? Do you need it at the level of business process model and notation? Probably not, but maybe you use some of those symbols. Do you need the detail to know where data is stored or what information is needed? So all these things you have to talk to them about, how detailed are you going to make it? For the example I'm showing, there's quite a bit of detail, but I could have gotten into even more detail, but for our example today, we didn't want to do that. You got to name the process, make it a name that everybody understands what it is. Don't use acronyms or jargon. Again, third step is how does this process start? And what's your end point? What's the end goal? And that's really sending and showing the scope of the project or the scope of the process. Identify those swim lanes or the departments. You know, who's involved? What are the roles? Who are the actors that are performing those tasks? And then you start working and understanding, well, who's doing what? What are those pieces? How do you break them down? Note those interactions, those handoffs, the information needed, maybe even some data that's needed or needs to be stored. If you really get into the business process model and notation, which is at higher level type of process or technique, you might even like figure out, well, when you do a handoff, how is it done? Is it through fax, email, online, the length of time, all those type of things, which a lot of times you don't need that detail, but when business analysts do it, sometimes they do need to have that level. Typically, you draw it on a paper first, whiteboard, and then you put it in the software. And once you get it into the software, whoops, went too fast. I started with the participants, and I figured out that I'm going to do a horizontal swim lane. I used most of the standard symbols, and then once I got it drawn, then I went back to talent acquisition just to make sure I did capture all those steps and see if I needed to make any tweaks. Some notes and tips before I show you the example. Make sure you talk to all the subject matter experts. Maybe it's easy to maybe just do a facilitated meeting and you have a whiteboard out there or a big sticky or big piece of paper, and you give everybody sticky notes that kind of help figure out what the tasks are, and then you can draw those interactions and connections that way, and then you finally put it into the software. And a lot of experts say that you should not have any more than 5 swim lanes, otherwise it gets really too complicated and your map just gets really huge, for one thing. So here's my example. So first, you figure out the process to map. So I went to HR, and I know that, you know, I've been through the hiring process. So that just seemed like an easy one to do, and they already had it mapped out in a simple type of flow chart. So we named it just hiring process. That's pretty simple. You know, what are your start and your end points? What events start the process? What events end it? And in our case, it starts pretty much in the hiring manager side of things, where a position is open. Maybe it's a new position, maybe it's an open position, but it's some sort of event triggered it, like a retirement, a resignation, termination, reorg, whatever the case may be. How does it end? Well, the candidate accepts the offer, they're hired, and then the onboarding process begins. And that's a whole different process, and that's out of the scope. So that's where we ended. Who are the roles? Talked about this already: hiring manager, talent acquisition, and HR put together. There's a separate interview team, and then the applicant. So I'm not going to go through the process in detail, but I just want to highlight a couple things. So really it starts with the hiring manager, and they have to fill out a form, and then that gets sent to HR. So I designated TA for talent acquisition. So talent acquisition is part of the HR department. There's other roles in the HR department, but talent acquisition is the primary role. So I designated that in terms of what steps they do versus maybe HR in general. If there's a task that kind of overlaps, which includes both of the different roles, then I kind of made it so that it was kind of intersecting both roles or both lanes. So like in this case, talent acquisition schedules and has a meeting with the hiring manager. So I kind of put it, you know, overlapping the roles or the lanes. Here's an example of a decision, a gateway. This, the second to bottom row is the interview team. And again, you can see that the TA, the hiring manager, and the interview team interview the candidate. So it's kind of a crossover between the roles of the candidate on the very bottom and the interview team. The interview team makes their recommendation, and it goes up to the hiring manager, who makes the decision on who they're going to hire. And then it goes back to talent acquisition or HR to do the reference checks and all that good stuff. And if they don't pick somebody, then it'll go all the way back to the beginning of the process where they might have to repost. And so here's the end where the candidate on the bottom actually accepts the offer. If they accept it, well, then it ends, candidate gets hired, onboarding begins, and that's a whole new process. If no, then it goes back to the interview team. Was there a second choice? And it goes back through, and does the hiring manager, think, oh, that's the next best person, and then it might go back through that process again. So that's what it looks like in total. So a couple of key things. Our process was about 24 steps. And I know after I mapped it, I think there's a couple steps that were missed, obvious steps that should have been included in there. When I have students do this, a lot of times they forget the decision-making gateways, the diamonds, or sometimes there's a flow stop where one of the participants do some activities, but then it doesn't react. There's no handoff or interaction with the other roles, and sometimes it's really confusing. So it's not really, you should really only have one beginning and one end point. So those are some of the things that I see when my students do mapping when they're learning how to do this. So think about your hiring process at your company and all the different roles, the different steps, the different handoffs, the different interconnections, who makes the decisions, how's it start, how's it end. So it takes a little time and thought through, and you're not going to get it the first time around. So what I want to end with is that some of the software. So I used Visio, which is a Microsoft product. So if you're a Microsoft house, that's probably what you're going to use. But you can also use it in PowerPoint, Word, or Excel, which is more complicated. When you open up the software, you might not see a swim lane as a choice. You probably need to pick a cross-functional diagram. That's sometimes how they name it in the software. There's also some free trials that you can try out, some other software that I have listed there, like Lucidchart or Smart Draw. Those are some common ones that my students use. You can do a couple free process maps in those without having.
Joanne and Cindy, we're just running up about 3 minutes here, and I just wanted to make sure we have some time for questions if anyone has any.
Yep, so I am done. So I don't know how we can share some of these links. Maybe if somebody wants to PowerPoint, they can do that. The two top ones are some really good sources that explain how to make a peanut butter and jelly. That's that fun one. And then how to make toast is a really good one.
So did we clarify how many steps it does take, or do they have to watch the video to find out?
It really varies.
Okay.
So what the video showed is a father who had his kids write out the steps of how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And it's really funny because he'll follow the steps exactly. And it's really funny how the kids miss just obvious things. So it just kind of gets you thinking about, yeah, you might know how to make something, but when you actually write it out or you put it in a flow, it's not that obvious.
We'll have to watch then. We do have a question.
Yep.
Elmer's asking, how do you determine whether to use a vertical or horizontal swim lane chart? Does it matter by industry? It
does not. I think it's more of a personal preference. I think most people use it horizontal. That just seems like how your brain works versus the other way. That's what I'm used to making it horizontal, but it's a preference.
And I'm just typing in the chat. If you would like a copy of the slide deck for the resources, please share your email in the chat. Excellent. And thank you all so much for attending our Business Connection today. We do hold these monthly. Typically, it is the second Wednesday of each month. We'll make sure and add your emails, or if you want to follow our LinkedIn page, you can find out the dates on those. Our next topic in July, we will have a guest speaker from CD Smith talking about using TikTok for B2B purposes. So hope you can join us then. Again, thank you all for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.